Many thanks for the introduction. It's an honor to deliver the inaugural Alfred Wiener Holocaust Memorial Lecture in 2020. And I would like to thank the Wiener Library and Gresham College for the invitation. On the 27th of January 1945, sometime in the afternoon, prisoners in Auschwitz saw something strange and eerie. It was a bitter cold day under a leaden winter sky. The paths and roads between the maze of wooden barracks and brick buildings on the sprawling grounds of the concentration camp were covered in snow. Then, suddenly, some of these snow piles started to move. They looked like ghosts, one prisoner thought. But when these strange apparitions came closer, moving past frozen corpses strewn across the grounds, it became clear that these were Soviet reconnaissance troops in white camouflage. And the prisoners knew what that meant. The day they had thought about, talked about, dreamt about, during months or years of indescribable suffering inside Auschwitz, that day was finally here. The day of liberation. There were screams of joy as inmates ran towards the soldiers to hug and kiss them. Others, barely able to stand, emerged from the barracks, draped in coarse blankets, to convince themselves that it really was true, that they were free, and that the SS would never return. We laughed and cried and could not fathom the joy of our liberation, one of these survivors later wrote. At the time, news of the liberation of Auschwitz barely reached the world outside, in sharp contrast to the media blitz after the liberation of camps like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen a few months later during the dying days of the Second World War. But Auschwitz was not overlooked for very long, and today it is hard to imagine a time when it was not a household name, a time when Auschwitz was not the symbol of Nazi Germany, of the concentration camps, and of the Holocaust. In fact, Auschwitz has become even more a global benchmark for judging inhumanity. The UN resolution designating the day of its liberation, the 27th of January, as Holocaust Remembrance Day, warns of the universal dangers of intolerance and prejudice. Some have stretched the significance of Auschwitz even further, using it as a universal emblem of evil to draw skewed analogies for political purposes, from abortion to vivisection. As the historian Scholl Freelander put it, Auschwitz is the central metaphor for evil in our time. As a result, Auschwitz has turned into a site with many different meanings, threatening to obscure its often very intricate history. Before it became a symbolic space, Auschwitz was a concrete historical one which grew and developed in complex ways. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of its liberation this year, I want to take this opportunity and place the camp back into history and reflect on questions like, what was Auschwitz? How did it evolve? What was its role in the Holocaust? Above all, I want to focus on the fateful months before and after liberation to get a clearer sense of what it is exactly that we commemorate on the 27th of January. Before I do so, though, I want to briefly clear up 4 common misconceptions about the camp and about its history. First, Auschwitz is not synonymous with the Holocaust, the radical persecution and systematic murder of European Jews by the Nazi regime. The paramilitary SS, which operated Auschwitz, killed about 1 million Jewish men, women and children there, more than in any other single site within the Nazi Empire. Still, there was more to the Holocaust than Auschwitz. The great majority of the murdered 6 million Jews died elsewhere. Up to 2 million were killed by poison gas in out-and-out death camps such as Treblinka, which operated in Nazi-occupied Poland independently of Auschwitz and the SS concentration camp system. Other Jewish victims were executed by Nazi killing squads in ghettos, fields, forests, during massacres sometimes described as the Holocaust by bullets. Or they died of illness and starvation in ghettos, in forced labor camps, under the infernal conditions created by the German forces. Second, despite the preeminence of Auschwitz in Holocaust memory, the camp was not created for the annihilation of European Jewry. Instead, it was established in spring-summer 1940 to terrorize the Polish population and destroy the Polish resistance. Auschwitz was set up as the first SS concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland, following the German invasion in 1939, which marks the beginning of the Second World War. We see a photo here of the Auschwitz SS outside the so-called staff building in Auschwitz, which is the building where the first Polish political prisoners were taken in summer 1940 before the nearby main camp was finished and they moved there. For well over a year, Polish political prisoners made up the vast majority of victims in Auschwitz. Then, in autumn 1941, these surviving Polish prisoners were joined by thousands of others, Soviet POWs, who were sent to Auschwitz as slave laborers. The camp's new huge extension at nearby Birkenau, where the SS would later build new crematoria and gas chambers to murder the Jews of Europe, was initially earmarked for these Soviet prisoners. Jewish prisoners, meanwhile, were still in a small minority. On the 6th of January 1942, that is 2 weeks before the infamous Wannsee Conference, where leading Nazi officials came together outside Berlin to coordinate the so-called final solution. On the 6th of January 1942, the Auschwitz SS counted less than 200 registered Jewish inmates among the well over 10,000 prisoners. This leads to the third point I want to make, and that is that Auschwitz came rather late to the Holocaust. The Nazi war against the Jews intensified dramatically during the second half of 1941, following the German attack on the Soviet Union. By the end of the year, around 600,000 Jews have been killed in the newly conquered Soviet territories. The Nazi regime was already moving towards the extermination of European Jewry as a whole. Plans were now underway for regional killing facilities in occupied Poland and occupied Soviet territory, targeting Eastern European Jews, especially those judged by the German authorities to be unfit for work. Chelmno was the first such death camp to operate in December 1941. We see here a photo of a deportation of Jews from Lodz to the Chelmno death camp. Auschwitz, meanwhile, at this point was not yet a Holocaust death camp. Systematic deportations of Jewish men and women began in March 1942, but these transports were still primarily about slave labor, not about immediate mass extermination. This function only emerged during late spring and summer 1942, and only from July 1942 did mass deportations from across Europe and the murder of those judged unfit for labor on arrival become routine. But Auschwitz was still eclipsed by other death camps. In 1942, around 190,000 Jews died in Auschwitz compared to over 800,000 in Treblinka. It was only later, towards the end of the Second World War, when Treblinka and other death camps had already closed down again, and the majority of Jews under Nazi rule had been murdered, that Auschwitz became what the historian Peter Hayes called the capital of the Holocaust. Fourth, and finally, it's important to stress that Auschwitz was singular in the Third Reich. It was the only SS concentration camp that also operated as a major Holocaust death camp. Conversely, it was the only major Holocaust death camp to also operate as a concentration camp. What does that mean? Well, death camps like Treblinka had only a single function, and that was to kill as many Jews as possible, as quickly as possible. It often took only a few hours between the arrival of a deportation train at Treblinka and the murder of all those on board. Auschwitz, by contrast, had more than a single purpose and held Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners alike. Auschwitz was always a site with multiple missions, including murderous slave labor for the German authorities. Labor dominated the lives of registered prisoners, Jews and non-Jews, and not just in the main camp and Birkenau, but far beyond, as the Auschwitz SS set up more than 36 satellite camps near construction sites, factories, farms, mines, and more. The biggest of these satellite camps was established near Monowitz, where prisoners had to build a huge IG Farben factory for the production of synthetic fuel and rubber. It was this singular nature of Auschwitz as a unique hybrid of concentration camp and major death camp that gave rise to the so-called SS selections of Jewish prisoners on arrival, which started in summer 1942. We see a photograph taken here by an SS man in Auschwitz in May 1944 of one such so-called selection of Jews arriving on a deportation train from Hungary and Birkenau. As far as the Auschwitz SS was concerned, all Jews were doomed. The only question was how they would die. Some would be registered for murderous forced labor, together with non-Jewish prisoners, and worked to death. The great majority, the young and old, the weak and sick, mothers with children, would be sent straight to these specially constructed gas chambers. Let me now return to the 27th of January 1945. As we've seen, the Day of Liberation has become the day when we commemorate the Holocaust. But the camp that Soviet soldiers encountered that day was very different from what it had been just a few months earlier, the time it reached its murderous peak. By January 1945, Auschwitz was no longer a huge Holocaust death camp, where thousands of Jews were murdered on a daily basis. Neither was it a vast concentration camp where many tens of thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners toiled daily for the German war effort. The camp that the Red Army liberated on the 27th of January was, in many ways, an empty ruin. In view of the advancing Red Army, the SS had spent several months preparing for the evacuation of the camp. If Auschwitz had to be abandoned, then nothing of use and value was supposed to be left behind. As a result, many buildings were dismantled and destroyed. This included, for example, the huge warehouse compound right next to the Birkenau gas chambers, where the belongings of murdered Jews had been stored. The remnants of these wooden barracks were still smouldering when the Soviet soldiers arrived. The SS also demolished the crematoria and gas chambers. As we can see here, a Soviet photograph of one of the destroyed crematoria. Dr. Miklos Nischli, a Jewish pathologist who was forced to work as a prisoner doctor in Birkenau, watched as inmates tore down the crematoria. Seeing the red brick walls tumble, he later recalled, I had a presentiment of the Third Reich's own destruction. The SS carried out this demolition job until the very end. During the night of 25th to 26th of January 1945, with the Red Army already in striking distance, the SS blew up the last remaining crematorium. All that was left of the so-called death factory were collapsed roofs, broken concrete beams, and piles of rubble covered by layers of snow. This was part of a larger attempt to cover up the Holocaust, just as SS troops had done at other sites of Nazi mass murder. In Treblinka, for example, the grounds where the death camp once stood had been turned into farmland, surrounded by newly planted pine trees. The Auschwitz SS destroyed not only the machinery of mass murder, but also incriminating records like deportation lists. Also, prisoners had to dig up pits full of human remains, crush the bone fragments, and dump it all into a nearby river. But the Auschwitz SS was not all about camouflage and destruction. It was also determined to salvage goods, to reuse them elsewhere. This might seem absurd, given that the Allies were fast closing in on what remained of Hitler's Germany. But the SS could never openly acknowledge that the war was lost. To do so would have been treason. And some fanatical SS men genuinely still believed that the tide could turn. Men like an Auschwitz commando leader who told a prisoner, quote, "Listen up, you Jew, our Führer has a secret weapon which he will soon launch against our enemies." And so the SS shipped out countless items towards central Germany, trying to strip Auschwitz bare. In the last weeks, the SS moved out hundreds of thousands of items from the warehouse compound, including piles of clothes of Jewish children gassed in Birkenau. It also moved away building materials and technical equipment, such as the X-ray machine that had been used for sterilization experiments. And the SS also salvaged some of the murderous hardware. Many parts of the crematoria were taken apart and packed up. As prisoners dismantled the ventilators, they found watches and jewelry hidden by victims just moments before they'd been gassed. The disassembled parts of the crematoria were then shipped westwards, and their final destination was a secret location near Mauthausen concentration camp, where the SS planned to rebuild at least 2 of the Birkenau crematoria. This rebuilding process was supposed to be supervised, it seems, by several Auschwitz specialists in mass murder, who were transferred to Mauthausen in January 1945. Their transfer was part of an exodus of Auschwitz staff towards the end. On the 15th of January 1945, the SS still counted more than 4,500 staff across the complex. These were the men and women who oversaw the winding down of operations and the last murders in the camp, though they also still found time for fun and diversions. On the 19th of December 1944, less than 6 weeks before liberation, a Berlin dance band performed in the Auschwitz SS service club. And as we can see on this photograph here, in early January 1945, senior SS officers, led by the last commandant of Auschwitz, Richard Baer, shot dozens of rabbits during a hunt in the snow, followed by food and drink in the SS officer mess. But when the Soviet troops arrived, just a few weeks later, the SS had gone. Almost all of the prisoners were gone as well. There were just 7,500 inmates left on the 27th of January, only a fraction of the over 135,000 inmates held in the complex in the previous summer. Most of the prisoners left behind in Auschwitz were sick and weak and had been abandoned during the final evacuation of the camp in mid-January, when the SS forced tens of thousands onto the icy roads outside, facing a 40-mile march followed by grueling train transports. And we have an image here from a covert film shot by a resident in Kollin in central Bohemia of one such train transport of Auschwitz prisoners. Deluded SS officers hoped to force these prisoners into slave labor once they reached concentration camps further west, to help turn the tide in the war in Germany's favor. Among these evacuated prisoners were 16-year-old Elie Wiesel, who was just skin and bones after months inside the camp, and his father Shlomo, who walked next to him, utterly exhausted. It was only because of his father, Wiesel later wrote, that he did not give up and let himself sink into the snow. Many others did, or were shot by the SS. Overall, an estimated 15,000 men, women and children from the abandoned Auschwitz complex perished during these death transports in January 1945. Now, the Auschwitz Death March is part of Holocaust memory, at least in its broader outline. What is far less well known is that the process of moving prisoners away from Auschwitz had in fact begun months earlier. For most of its life, Auschwitz had been the final destination for prisoners. Few prisoners who arrived had ever left the camp alive. In 1942, for example, less than 2,000 prisoners left Auschwitz for another concentration camp. But that changed in 1944, when the flow was starting to be reversed, and more than 80,000 prisoners in 1944 were sent from Auschwitz to other camps, such as Buchenwald. A number of these mass transports took place in the summer of 1944, and that was linked to the Holocaust in Hungary. Following the German invasion of Hungary in March 1944, the Germans quickly put a huge deportation program in place. Between mid-May and mid-July 1944, trains rolled on an almost daily basis to Auschwitz, bringing at least 430,000 Jews to the camp. Such numbers in such short a space of time were unprecedented in Auschwitz, and so was the murderous frenzy that followed, since the great majority of Jews from Hungary were declared unfit for work by the SS and murdered on arrival. Others, however, were selected for slave labor. Some of them remained in Auschwitz, but others were sent to camps inside the old German borders, after the Nazi regime, facing a growing shortage of labor power late in the war, reversed an earlier ban on deploying Jewish prisoners inside the German heartland. For example, in early June 1944, a transport with 4,000 male prisoners, most or all of them from Hungary, was sent from Auschwitz to a satellite camp of Groß-Rosen to help construct a huge network of underground bunkers for Hitler and the top brass of the Nazi regime. More prisoner transports from Auschwitz followed in autumn and winter 1944, prior to the death march. As a result, the daily Auschwitz prisoner population almost halved in 4 months, dropping to around 70,000 by late December 1944. In due course, several compounds were closed down and dismantled, including a huge expansion in Birkenau itself. Among the prisoners who left Auschwitz around this time were Anne Frank and her older sister Margot. They'd arrived in Auschwitz in early September 1944 on the last major deportation train to leave the Netherlands, having been arrested in hiding in Amsterdam. In early November 1944, Anne and Margot were then forced on another deportation train with around 1,000 women selected for slave labor and deported from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. As a result of all these deportations and the death march, many Auschwitz barracks, once unbearably overcrowded, stood empty when the Red Army arrived. Soviet soldiers found a largely deserted complex, a desolate ghost town, stripped bare, broken down, without SS staff, and with few survivors. This was Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945, the day the camp ceased to exist as an SS camp. But the end of Auschwitz should not lead us to believe that the Holocaust ended that day too, or that the suffering of its former prisoners was over. Because the ghost of Auschwitz, as we will see next, lived on for several more terrible months inside other concentration camps with deadly consequences. In late January 1945, tens of thousands of former Auschwitz prisoners were held in other concentration camps following these earlier deportations. More would join them over the coming days as further survivors of the death march arrived. On 27th of January 1945, the very day of liberation, a transport of male prisoners reached Buchenwald, more than a week after leaving Auschwitz. In a contemporary document, even the Buchenwald SS doctor had to concede that their physical condition was, quote, poor. The sick and exhausted men from Auschwitz joined more than 100,000 prisoners in Buchenwald, the largest remaining concentration camp complex at this point. Around 1 in 3 of these prisoners in Buchenwald was Jewish, mostly from Hungary, Poland, and for them, as well as for many non-Jews, the end of suffering was still a long way off. The most lethal spaces inside the remaining camps were special compounds, where the SS left ill prisoners to die. Among the worst such compounds was the so-called Little Camp in Buchenwald, which was desperately overcrowded with starving and sick prisoners covered in sores, wounds, dirt, vermin, and excrement. We see a photo here taken by US troops of the little camp after liberation. Elie Wiesel has been identified as the 7th from the left in the second row of bunks. Between January and April 1945, more than 5,000 prisoners died inside the Buchenwald Little Camp, including recent arrivals from Auschwitz. One of these victims was Shlomo Wiesel, who had survived the death march from Auschwitz, only to die in Buchenwald. His son later said that Buchenwald, which had promised to be an improvement on Auschwitz, turned out to be much the same. At first, he later wrote, the little camp was almost worse for me than Auschwitz. And after his father died, Elie Wiesel lost the will to live too. Someone had died inside me, he later wrote, and that someone was me. Camps other than Buchenwald also became disaster zones in early 1945. Never before in the history of the SS concentration camps would so many inmates perish from disease and deprivation than in the final months of the war. The deadliest camp of them all was Bergen-Belsen. The camp doubled in size in just 8 weeks, reaching over 40,000 prisoners by early March 1945. And as the camp grew, so did hunger, illness, and death inside. In March 1945 alone, more than 18,000 prisoners are estimated to have perished in Bergen-Belsen, including survivors of Auschwitz. Among them were Anne and Margot Frank, who died ravaged by typhus and dysentery. In addition to death by deprivation, the camp SS also continued to execute prisoners en masse because they were regarded as dangerous, because they knew too much about SS crimes, or because they were frail and sick and therefore seen as health risks, as drains on resources, or as obstacles during forthcoming evacuations. In the early months of 1945, the SS executed several tens of thousands of inmates by shooting, lethal injection, and gas. In Ravensbrück, for example, the first purpose-built SS camp for women, the SS started to operate its own gas chamber around late January, early February 1945. A former SS officer later testified that 150 women were forced into the chamber at any one time, told that they would be deloused before the gas was inserted. After 2 or 3 minutes, it was quiet inside, the SS officer later recalled. This officer was Johann Schwarzhuber, who had recently arrived in Ravensbrück, having previously served for several years in Auschwitz. And Schwarzhuber was surrounded by several familiar faces from Auschwitz, killing experts who'd been dispatched to Ravensbrück to help decimate supposedly sick or dangerous prisoners. They were led by none other than Rudolf Höss, the first Auschwitz commandant who had appeared in Ravensbrück in late 1944 to supervise mass shootings and the construction of the new gas chamber. Former Auschwitz staff also played a prominent role in other SS concentration camps in 1945. After the evacuation of Auschwitz, some SS staff had been sent to fight at the front, but many more were redeployed to other camps and brought all they had learned about abuse and killing with them. At the top stood senior Auschwitz officers, veterans of the Holocaust. Richard Beer, for example, whom we last met on the rabbit hunt across the frozen meadows around Auschwitz, was appointed as the new commandant of Dora concentration camp, where he oversaw an immediate increase in violence. Another new commandant, Josef Kramer in Bergen-Belsen, had arrived via Auschwitz as well, followed by other veterans of the camp. They are all bastards, thugs, and sadists, one Jewish prisoner noted in his secret Bergen-Belsen diary in 1945. One day in the previous summer, in July 1944, Kramer, Beer, Höss, and other Auschwitz staff had gathered, all smiles, at the rustic SS retreat called Solarhütte, some 30 kilometers outside of Auschwitz, to toast the mass murder of Hungarian Jews in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And we see here a photo taken at that time in July 1944, showing Beer, Mengele, the SS doctor in Birkenau, Kramer and Höss. Several months on, Auschwitz was no more, and these men now presided over the final cataclysm of violence in camps like Bergen-Belsen and Ravensbrück. Even after its demise then, Auschwitz still cast a long shadow over the SS concentration camp system. This shadow was not lifted until the Allies liberated the last camps and inmates in April and early May 1945. SS killings continued until the very end, inside the camps and on further death marches and transports, as the SS forced hundreds of thousands of prisoners onto the road once more. The SS often shot weak and infirm prisoners who slowed the treks down. And some of these SS killers had first become mass murderers back in Auschwitz. Men like Otto Moll, the former chief of the Birkenau crematorium complex, who had also taken part in the SS celebration of the Holocaust in the summer of 1944 at Solarhütte. His superiors clearly valued Moll's expertise in mass extermination and put him in charge, in early 1945, of a mobile killing unit made up of other Birkenau veterans. The unit participated in murders in Ravensbrück, as well as other massacres, before Moll moved on to a large Dachau satellite camp, where Jewish prisoners knew him as the henchman from Auschwitz. When Dachau was partially abandoned in April 1945, Moll participated in the death march, where witnesses saw him beat up and shoot numerous prisoners who had collapsed from exhaustion. Let me conclude. In recent decades, Auschwitz has become the focal point for remembrance of the Holocaust. We see an older postcard here of the entrance to the main camp in Auschwitz. And there are very good reasons for the prominence of Auschwitz in Holocaust memory. Auschwitz epitomizes the enormous scale of the Holocaust, with more Jews murdered inside than in any other single place in Nazi-controlled Europe. Auschwitz also encapsulates the vast reach of the Holocaust all across Europe, Only in Auschwitz did the SS systematically kill Jews from across the continent, deported to their deaths from Poland and Hungary, Greece, Italy, Norway, and many other countries. Because of its singular nature, Auschwitz captures many facets of the Holocaust, from destruction through labor to the extermination of those declared unfit for work. So Auschwitz must hold a central place in the commemoration of the Holocaust. Still, the dominant memory of Auschwitz should not obscure the fate of other victims elsewhere. There are many other places and many other days in addition to the 27th of January, which must also be part of our commemoration. Think, for example, of the 29th and 30th September 1941, when SS and policemen shot over 30,000 Jews, mostly women and children, at a large ravine called Babi Yar outside Kiev, the bloodiest massacre during the Holocaust by bullets. Or think of the 19th of April 1943, when a German attempt to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto, which had been the largest Nazi ghetto in occupied Poland at one point, holding almost 450,000 Jews under catastrophic conditions, when the German attempt to liquidate that ghetto was met with armed resistance, a desperate uprising against the Nazi policy of extermination. As for Auschwitz itself, we should remember that the 27th of January 1945, the day of its liberation, was only one of well over 1,500 days in a long, complex history of degradation, destruction, and death. Each single day brought more suffering, and one can easily think of days that capture the essence of Auschwitz more fully than its last day, when the camp was all but an empty shell, and just a tiny fraction of the estimated 1.3 million men, women, and children deported here was liberated. Finally, we must remember that the end of Auschwitz did not mean the end of suffering for Jews and other prisoners in SS camps. The Nazi regime never abandoned the final solution, and the murder of Jews continued even after the gassings in Auschwitz had stopped. Indeed, Auschwitz lived on for months after its liberation, elsewhere, through its dispersed staff and prisoners. The great majority of Auschwitz survivors were not liberated in Auschwitz itself, but in other camps, months later, after more indescribable suffering. Only the Allied victory put an end to the SS killings. The last major SS camp to be liberated was Ebensee, a satellite camp of Mauthausen, where US troops encountered an estimated 16,000 survivors on the 6th of March 1945. A number of these survivors had come from Auschwitz, some 350 miles away. Among them was Dr. Miklos Nischli, the Hungarian pathologist, who had endured many more weeks of terror since he left Auschwitz on the death march. And liberation did not put an end to suffering, not in Ebensee, where more than 700 liberated prisoners died within a few weeks, nor elsewhere either. As for those who lived and left the camps, like Nischli, they were marked forever by Auschwitz. As Nischli wrote a few months later in his memoir, he had returned home, but he was not free. Quote, "I walked like my own ghost, a restless figure in the once familiar streets." Thank you very much.